Good morning, church. Good morning. Will you pray with me? God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So here it is, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. For sexual minorities, this is one of the great texts of terror. It is a story that haunts us and is so deeply connected to the history of the systematic dehumanization of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and intersex people throughout the world and across the centuries. It is a monument that stands behind all of the gay pride parades that will be celebrated in our nation this June. It infuses our country's debate on marriage equality, and it gives its invisible heat to acts like the murder of Matthew Shepard. The traditional Christian understanding of this story goes something like this. Because the sin of homosexuality was so great in the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, God punished these communities by burning them off of the face of the earth. But before he destroys the city, God sends his angels to warn Lot to flee the impending destruction. The depravity of the citizens is on full display as they try to seize the angels and get to know them, or in the reading we just heard, have their sport with them, which is a euphemism for having sex with them. Lot protects his angelic guests and escapes before the cities are destroyed. In this reading, the sin of homosexuality is so disgusting to God that he steps into history and bends the laws of nature to rain down fire and sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah. To desire another person of the same sex, to fall in love with someone of the same gender, to alter one's gender to conform to one's inner truth, is not just evil in this view. It actually contradicts the purpose of creation, where one man and one woman are created specifically to procreate and populate the world. To be gay is seen as fundamentally unproductive. To be transgender or queer is to subvert God's intention for only two essential genders that are irrevocably assigned at birth. This undoing of creation, this assault against the sovereignty of God the King, is not allowed to go unanswered. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is God's answer to the perversion of nature manifest in sexual minorities. That's the traditional reading. That's the heterosexist reading. By heterosexism, I don't mean heterosexual. I mean a form of domination and oppression that uses pieces of heterosexuality, images of heterosexuality, aspects of heterosexuality, to legitimize its marginalization and dehumanization of sexualities, even some forms of heterosexuality that don't conform to its norm. But now hear this story told anew. Today is Sunday. On the calendar, Sunday is the first day of the week. But as an Easter people, we know that Sunday is the mystical eighth day of creation when God stopped resting. It is the day when he resurrected his Son and liberated us all from death. On this Sunday, this gay man is going to share what he knows about the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. On this Sunday, we are going to create something new because we worship the God of life, not death. We worship the God of love. We worship the God of Jonathan, who told David that he loved him more than any woman. We worship the God of Ruth, who said to Naomi, "I will follow you wherever you go." We worship the God who comes in drag by putting on the skin of a human being. We worship the transgender God, who is mother and father and transitions between the two at the drop of a hat. We worship the intersex God, who has all the parts. This is the God whose Holy Spirit we ask to guide our reading today. Invoking the queer God, hear these new words. The sin of Sodom and Gomorrah is not about homosexuality or being any other kind of sexual minority. Period. In chapter 18, verses 20 and 21, the authors of Genesis write, "Then the Lord said, 'How great is the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah, and how very grave their sin. I must go down and see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me. And if not, I will know.' Yes, Sodom and Gomorrah sinned, and yes, their sin was very great. But there is no mention of homosexuality, no mention of gender identity, or of multiple sexualities. To say this is to put words in God's mouth, to put human words in God's mouth, to put heterosexist words in God's mouth. Listen again to the human words that are used in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. The men of Sodom say to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we may know them." To the men of Sodom, these men, these angels in drag, were strangers, aliens from another land. They were not of their city and not of their tribe. When the men of Sodom say they want to know the strangers, they are saying they want to have sex with them. But here's the key. They don't want to have loving, intimate sex. They don't even want to have pleasurable sex. They want to have non-consensual, violating sex. They want to rape the foreigners. For the rapist, the ultimate sign of their strength and their worth comes from the ability to have power over another person, and sex is the tool to achieve this domination. It's troubling, to say the least, that the traditional heterosexist reading of this story refuses to pick up on this distinction. That reading conflates gay sex with violent and dehumanizing rape. The men of Sodom admit as much when they say, referring to Lot, "The fellow came here as an alien, and he would play judge? Now we will deal worse with you than with them." They admit that they want to deal badly with Lot and his guests. The men of Sodom are not motivated by lust. They're out to prove themselves by dehumanizing others. They're the worst kinds of bullies. God isn't going to have any of that. He's not going to play that game. In the heterosexist reading, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, God destroys the cities because they are a challenge to God's plan for humanity and his sovereignty. I actually couldn't agree more. But the example of Sodom and Gomorrah isn't an undoing of creation. It's a rejection of God's call for his people to embrace the weakest and most alienated of society. In Deuteronomy 10:17 through 19, the scribes write, "For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who is not partial and takes no bribe, who executes justice for the orphan and the widow, and who loves the stranger, providing them food and clothing. You shall also love the stranger, for you were strangers in Egypt." Lot is doing the work of God. He has welcomed the strangers into his home. He has given them shelter and fed them. The crime of the men of Sodom is to disrupt this holy work. It is to insinuate themselves between Lot and his guests and attempt to violate the strangers, who are among the weakest of society. In this month of gay pride, let's call a spade a spade. All of us who are sexual minorities have been bamboozled, and we've been bamboozled for a long, long time. Because we're not the Sodomites. I know we're called Sodomites. I know there have been anti-sodomy laws written against us and our families, but we're not the Sodomites. We're not the ones who are so disgusting to God that he had to wipe us from the face of the earth. The true Sodomites are the ones who prey on the weak, who violate the stranger and the guest, who take from the widow and the orphan. The perpetrators of these sins are the true perverts, the true adversaries of God, not us. And these are the sins that force God down from heaven. These are the sins that make the divine enter history, and these are the sins that bring a rain of fire and sulfur. None of this happens because we love someone of the same gender, or were born intersex, or transition from one gender to another. But even if LGBTQI people aren't the real Sodomites, we've certainly been treated like them, haven't we? Haven't we come to know what it feels like to be alienated from God in our own faith communities? Haven't we felt the burning sulfur of violence and discrimination in our lives? Haven't we been given a name that rings throughout the centuries as a brand of shame? The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah isn't a one-time historical event that happened sometime long, long ago. Sodom and Gomorrah are still burning right now in our lives, or in the lives of those we know and love. I think of those images of the survivors of the destruction of the World Trade Center Covered in ash, hobbled, bloodied, the survivors shuffled out of the burning, twisted metal of the fallen towers. Many of them had the look of people who had seen things their minds and souls will never fully process. This is the image I see when I think of myself and my LGBTQI brothers and sisters coming out of the Holocaust of our modern Sodom and Gomorrah. We are refugees from an unspeakable horror that was not perpetrated by God. God may have destroyed the ancient cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, but it was humans that tried to destroy us and are still trying to destroy us. Humans who put their own words in God's mouth and portray their domination as holy and sacred. A couple of weeks ago, I preached on the meaning of Pentecost, on the meaning of the fiery baptism that transformed the disciples, those who had learned from Jesus, into the apostles, those who spread the word of how they had directly experienced God working in their lives. It's fitting to think of this story in the context of the closing image of the story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Here we have Abraham, standing where he had been in the presence of God, and he looks out across the plain and he sees smoke from the burning cities that have just been destroyed. What was going through his mind as he stood there? What was he thinking? As we sit in this place, where we have encountered God, where we have been his disciples, what do we think as we look out and see the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah still burning? What are we thinking in this month of gay pride as we still see refugees covered in ash, stumbling out of a ruin where they have been violated in the name of God and of normal sexuality? On this 8th day of creation, we're not thinking about rest. We're thinking about all of the work still to do. We're thinking about how members of FCC are going to staff a booth at the Pride Festival in Maplewood. We're thinking about how we can continue our outreach of radical hospitality, symbolized by the big gay flag on the front of this church. We're thinking about how we can continue to host local organizations in our building that fight for the equality of sexual minorities here in New Jersey and across the country. And we're thinking about how the United Church of Christ is still not yet 100% open and affirming, and what we can do to help the denomination achieve the inclusion of all those Christ calls to his table. Sodom and Gomorrah are still burning, and we have so much work to do. On this Sunday, on this new day of creation, we cannot rest. Amen.